Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Heroic Haven. Today, we're talking about Blade 3, aka Blade Trinity, an absolute disaster, a car wreck of a movie that features all kinds of craziness that you simply can't look away from. I'm Trevor Lane, joined by my guy, Donnie. Donnie, I can't wait to dive into this one, or should I say, sink my teeth into this one.
That was a good one. I just gotta say, I don't care what anyone says. Blade Trinity is awesome. It's honestly the best Marvel movie ever. So if you don't agree
Anytime
with
you
that,
can
you can
take
argue with the wall, man.
Anytime you can take a classic character like Dracula and say, nah, we're just going to call him Drake, you have to do it, right?
Yeah, he's man.
All right. So Blade Trinity introduced us to, of course, Ryan Reynolds, not as Deadpool at that time, but Ryan Reynolds, Wesley Snipes. We see them again in Deadpool and Wolverine. They're in it. We've got Jessica Biel in it. In fact, let's kick things off there. One of the early zany things coming out of this movie, Blade wanted to drive a stake in Jessica Biel. What's going on with that?
Setting aside the fact that just the whole premise of their relationship and all that, it's pretty weird. But regardless, yeah, apparently Wesley was pushing pretty hard for some sort of sex scene between those two. And we don't know who vetoed it, but it didn't make its way into the script, probably for the better.
She was literally the daughter of his mentor who dies at the beginning of the movie. It's supposed to be this big, like, emotional moment. And later, Blade is wanting to, drive his stake home. But that's
Yeah, apparently there's some reports that apparently Wesley was working pretty hard towards trying to get that set up. He was even doing other movies to maybe set himself up for potentially having this sex scene that he had been wanting to have in this movie. So it was pretty interesting.
he was working pretty hard. All right, let's go to from biker bodyguards to post-its. The madness in this movie doesn't end. What's the story here? Why are bikers being brought in to protect the director?
Yeah, so I want to say, and I should have said this earlier, most of the stuff's kind of alleged, right? We don't
Sure.
have like full perfect accounts from the main actors, this and that. Some of this stuff we do, but a lot of it's pretty alleged. And this is one of the things that is pretty alleged as well. So supposedly Wesley and the director of this movie, I believe his name was David Goyer, got into an altercation, right? So the thing with this movie was Wesley thought that he should have had more creative control over the movie, who was taking a part of it, who was producing, directing, all these other things. And also one of the things that he wanted was to have a more diverse cast. Long story short, he wanted more non-white people working on the movie or in the movie, I guess. Anyway, so they were not able to see eye to eye for various reasons, whether it was the script, the staff, etc. And ultimately it leads to an altercation where apparently Wesley decides to choke him out or something akin to that. So the funny thing is, apparently afterwards, the following evening, David Goyer, the producer of the movie, like I mentioned earlier, goes to a strip club and asks a bunch of biker dudes there to show up on set and pretend to be his bodyguards the following morning. So they're not actually his bodyguards, but he pays them to show up and basically intimidate Wesley. And so from there, Wesley kind of just goes away and leaves him alone verbally anyway. So that was definitely interesting. The fake biker bodyguard thing is just, it just sounds like something from a movie, not something that happens behind the
Right?
scenes of making a movie. I don't really get it, but yeah. So just a bunch of weird stuff like that took place with this movie. And a lot of it actually we're not even going to mention in this video. So definitely look it up if you want to.
The story of making this movie is more interesting than the movie itself.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
apparently it got so bad that the only communication between Snipes and Goyer was via post-it notes, which I don't know if that
Yeah.
actually influenced the Sticky Quips episode of The Office or not, but, but that is absolute absurdity to where you've got two people who are grown adults who are supposed to be professionals, and the only way they can actually communicate with each other is by leaving post-it notes all over the place.
Yeah, Wesley wound up being very hard to work with on this movie. I don't want to paint him as like the only bad guy. I'm sure there's
Sure.
multiple sides to everything, but he winds up being pretty hard to work with on this movie. And he was method acting a lot. He was oftentimes, it's pretty weird to try to method act a murderous vampire type guy, but okay. He oftentimes was signing things or mentioning himself as Blade, and with the post-it notes, he would only communicate with the director as Blade. He would say these things and say from Blade, sign Blade at the end of it. So definitely pretty interesting.
Wow. I hope somebody saved some of those post-it notes because I'm sure some totally normal stuff was written on them. Let's jump. This is like the internet gold, urban legend type stuff, but it's real because you can actually see the footage of it. There was a scene in the movie where Wesley Snipes, he is all he has to do is open his eyes, and he refuses to do it. So they have to CGI in eyes, and it's the most ridiculous, absurd looking thing since Superman's mustache. What what happened here? Why was he so difficult to work with, where he would not even open his eyes in this point?
Yeah, see, that's kind of a little bit of what I was talking about earlier, where just creative differences basically with Wesley, to where he almost does like a whole like pout thing where he's like, I don't want to talk to you, don't talk to me. You're not doing things the way that I want. So I'm gonna basically throw a fit. And so there was a lot of times in the movie where they'll ask him to do something and he flat out refuses it. If you go back and watch the movie, you'll see him from time to time where they shoot to him because he's supposed to have a line or something, but all they could get from him is just him standing there. Like he's not saying anything, he's just doing nothing. And then they have to obviously show him every so often in the movie. He's the main character of the movie and the franchise, right? So they have to show him, but they're not showing him doing anything. And so ultimately, if you want to take anything away from this video, this is ironclad proof that he was being pretty difficult to work with, because there's literally no reason you should protest opening your eyes on this on the bed in the morgue or whatever. It's a really weird, silly thing, and it's so bad that they needed it done, so they CGI'd it on, and it looked terrible. So well, okay, it looks terrible now. Do you think it looked good back then? Maybe, is it one of those situations?
No, I think it still looked terrible even back then. It's noticeable even back then. It was pretty bad. Now,
2004.
yeah, maybe though. Maybe he didn't want to open his eyes because they were a little too bloodshot from, Blade doing a little bit of blazing. That's how he was,
Yeah.
dealing with the stress of this movie. That apparently was an issue as well.
Yeah, he apparently was not. We already kind of explained a bit, and we'll explain a little bit more how he's not really working with anybody, not really talking. In fact, he's flat out not talking to pretty much anybody unless he has to. Very minimal lines in the movie relative, like I said, to what you would expect from the main character. And one thing he would do is he would have himself locked in his trailer the entire day, basically, while he smoked weed the entire time. And then afterwards, he'd come out and film whatever needed to be filmed, completely blazed. So that's interesting. I feel like that's probably pretty common. It's just the locking yourself in isolation part that's a little bit weird, but I feel like the rest of it's probably pretty common for a lot of people today. But maybe back then it was a little bit more weird. So,
Well, and then we do have, I mean, like, this is part of why it was such a big deal. It was Ryan Reynolds against Wesley Snipes. Now we know Deadpool versus Blade. It's part of why Wesley Snipes' Blade being in Deadpool and Wolverine was such a big deal, because these two didn't get along on the set of Blade Trinity.
yeah, it seems almost more like it's a little bit of a one-sided thing. So ultimately, we've talked about it a lot, but it's just the undertone of the video. Long story short, Wesley was pretty hard to work with. And one of the things that was happening was that whenever there were scenes, because apparently the way he felt about it was that they were trying to set up a spin-off with the Night Stalkers and stuff like that, and he wasn't really a fan of that. So they were he didn't like that they were giving a lot of screen time to Beale's character, Reynolds' character, things like that, and almost made him a little bit of a supporting character in his movie. He wasn't really a big fan of that. And so every time he had a chance to, if Ryan had a scene, he was most of the time not talking to him. If Ryan was in his eyesight he's not supposed to be, he'll be like, get this C slur. I'll just say that. C slur out of my way, out of my sight, this and that. He's like saying a bunch of stuff like that, just and referring to him exclusively as a C the entire time. So it's definitely pretty interesting. And I'm not really sure if Ryan reciprocated that in any way, made him feel like he needed to be that way, but it almost feels like he just was kind of being that way just in general, and just again being very hard to work with. I don't think it was a two-sided thing. I think it was more of like a one-sided thing, because I mentioned this to you as well. Apparently there's a scene in the movie where Ryan Reynolds and Jessica Biel are talking, and he's telling her he doesn't really like me, and they're kind of having an honest conversation about that. According to Ryan Reynolds, that was something that they were not actually filming. that was an off-camera moment that the cameras happened to pick up. They're talking about in real life, like Wesley Snipes to Ryan Reynolds, not Blade to his character. So that was an interesting little tidbit as well.
So they thought that this is just a genuine moment. They're not acting in that moment, and it's Ryan
Yeah, they were
Reynolds
just
saying
talking.
Wesley Snipes doesn't like me, and it winds up making it into the movie, and it's Hannibal King saying Blade doesn't like me because it played so well. That's funny that he recognized that. But then afterwards, the movie came out, it bombed. Shocker, right? Which it's so disappointing because the first two Blade movies were so good, especially the first one
Yeah.
was amazing. But afterwards, we wind up with Wesley Snipes actually suing New Line Cinema after the movie did bomb. Maybe he was a little bit frustrated at the reception of the movie. He was probably frustrated with the whole process of the movie itself, but he actually winds up suing over how bad the movie turned out.
Yeah, he sued, I believe, 5 million over
Ooh.
damages, and he cited basically, by the way, this doesn't go anywhere. It doesn't Nothing happens with this. And this was just a few months after the movie released. He cited that he didn't like the things I mentioned earlier. He didn't like the casting choices. He didn't like all of that. He cited that he should have had more control over the production, basically, and ultimately sued for damages. I think in hindsight, it probably was because, like you said, maybe the movie wasn't doing so great. Probably didn't paint him in the best light. But regardless, though, it's just an interesting thing to see them wind up, or for a character to wind up suing the New Line Cinema, the production company or whatever, in relation to the performance in this movie and the way the movie was perceived. So definitely pretty interesting.
I'm pretty sure most people who watched the movie felt like suing afterwards as well. Last thing, I really think there could have been a great movie here. You wind up again. It bothers me that they changed Dracula's name to Drake. Like, why do we have to do that? This is like an early 2000s thing that we just have to do. And then look, you're fighting murderous vampires, and one of the key components of your character is that you're going to put in earbuds while you're doing so. Let's take away one of your senses while you're fighting these vampires that are trying to kill you. That makes no sense either. That's the tip of the iceberg with this movie. But there could have been a much better movie in here until they started making script changes. So maybe that was where Snipes' frustration probably really started. At some point, there was probably a good movie in this, and then it just kind of all fell apart.
Yeah, it seems like initially they had a script where it was more in line with the first couple of movies, less jokey, if you will,
Yeah.
less campy, less jokey, and it was more in line with those with more of like a serious tone to it, etc. They wind up scrapping that for a more, again, well, you saw what we got, more campy product, and Wesley Snipes said that he wasn't really happy with the juvenile humor in the movie, so that's something interesting as well, and you just kind of are left with this sour taste in your mouth because again, if you're Wesley, he thinks that the script changes are more so they can again do the spin-off and cater more towards the other characters in the movie. And ultimately he feels like he's being pushed out of the franchise. And it's kind of interesting where you mentioned Dracula. They were ultimately going to be doing something in this movie where Blade is confronting somebody for harvesting humans and he's dealing with his humanity, things like that, and questioning who he is. And so it was going to be more along the lines with that. But they ultimately didn't wind up going that way because they felt like it would be a little bit too grim, if you will. That's the word that I found used a lot in relation to this topic and why they changed the script. They thought it was too dark, probably. And the thing is, ultimately, I think that part of the reason why they decided to change this too was because I saw something that Marvel to produce this movie, the rights for Blade was only like $125,000, but Marvel wanted to stay absolutely clear of this project. They were super nervous about it. I'm sure it probably also just conceptually R-rated. They wanted nothing to do with that. Superhero movie R-rated with like vampires and all this stuff. They didn't want anything to do with that. So I think that when the movie comes out, the first one, and it's a success, and then you double back and it's like, okay, the next one's a success too. Maybe that third one, they wanted to try to get it more in line with what Marvel was expecting. I'm not really sure. Kind of weird because you're like, okay, the money's coming in. Why not follow the same formula? But it was so bad with like that first film. I don't believe that they even put the Marvel logo anywhere on it. I was telling you previously, growing up, I had no idea Blade was a part of Marvel. I just thought this was a cool movie that Wesley Snipes was acting in. He was doing cool action pieces. I thought that's all this was. So yeah, it's just a whole all around, from the script to the production of the movie, the way all the movies were handled. Definitely just weird. Probably not very much with. Probably more so with the times then, but not so great for the times now. Like, I don't think a lot of this is happening today.
No, definitely not. It's like they just took all these different concepts and ideas and kind of Frankenstein them together. And then at
Yeah.
the end said, hey, let's throw Triple H into the middle of it too, just for fun, because why not? And we wound up
I
with
forgot to mention
this.
that. Yeah.
Oh God. but now at least we get the proper send off to the character, because the first two movies were legitimately good. We get the proper send off to the character in Deadpool and Wolverine. At least we get that. And then who knows what's going to happen moving forward with the Blade franchise, because that's been a mess. But that is a story for another day. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Make sure you do subscribe to the channel, turn on those notifications as well. Hopefully, your day is going better than Blade Trinity wound up. Thanks, everybody. See ya and stay safe.